just like oil and water. They do not mix. They are always suspicious of one another. Wealth isn't the key metric that's going on. It's rather the psychology that the people have in terms of their theory of justice, their theory of happiness, and then the different emotions that they have.
How does this conflict escalate? How do the temperature rise into something like civil war, like Stasis?
They see it happen and they think, you know what, this is the last straw. I just can't handle this anymore. They've drawn their swords. They're ready to engage in violence. If you're going to have tools where one group is able to control the mistakes of the other group, you've got to make sure that that other group has tools at its disposal to take care of the mistakes of the first group. I can tell you what my worry is, that our society has become more oligarchic.
All right, so welcome back everybody to another episode of the Atheniano Show, where each episode is a new ripple containing unknown but unlimited impact. I think according to most polls and surveys and just people's general perception, we live in an increasingly divisive and polarized time, not just in the United States, but around the world. I think it's not a stretch to say that many people are concerned, or at least concerned about the possibility of another civil war happening sometime in the future. There was this movie out recently about a fictional civil war happening in the United States, but I think it resonated with a lot of people's concerns. And even just beyond that, I think a lot of people want to reduce tensions and de-escalate. So the question then becomes how? How do we do that? And I think one of the best places to look is to some of the greatest minds of human history. And yes, that is Aristotle and the ancient Greek philosophers. And it is for that reason that I am incredibly grateful to have Professor Skultety here with me, who is an expert in this field and a very well-renowned professor of philosophy at the University of Ole Miss. So thank you so much, Professor, for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I don't have time to go through your entire resume because it is quite impressive and vast, but I'll just say that you are the chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion at the University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss, where you're also a philosophy professor and the director of the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And you've also written a book called Conflict in Aristotle's Political Philosophy. You're the co-editor of Aristotle's Politics Critical Essays, and you've published numerous articles and essays, including The Humbling of an Impatient Cosmopolitan in Dissident Philosophers. And I'll put a link to all your works in the episode description for people that are interested. I highly recommend it. But nonetheless, once again, all this to say, just thank you so much for being here. So the way I've kind of set up this episode is 4 sections. They're not going to be super exact. There's some overlap, but generally it's 3 questions examining the way that ancient philosophers and Aristotle thought about conflict. So what is conflict? How does conflict arise? And how do we resolve conflict? And then the last one would be branching out and kind of recommendations to our modern world and the present day. But I want to just start with an introductory question about yourself and how you got into studying conflict, because I think it's a very unique area of study, particularly to do it within the ancient philosophers. So I would love to hear about how you got into that.
Well, originally, back in graduate school, I was really interested in this debate that took place between communitarians on the one hand and liberals on the other. So there were a lot of articles and books being written sort of engaging in that debate about whether a communitarian approach or a liberal approach would be better for contemporary political social world. And the thing I noticed about the work I was reading is that both Plato and Aristotle were always sort of recruited into the communitarian side of that debate. oftentimes by both sides, both the liberals and communitarians would sort of use Aristotle and Plato as examples of people who thought that our social political world should be very, very communal in some way. And what that always seemed to presuppose was that both of those philosophers didn't think that conflict had any place in society. And the thing that struck me as odd about that is that Aristotle, as I was reading him, was not in favor of eliminating all forms of conflict from our political and social world. And so that's what originally got me interested in this topic, is it just didn't seem right to think that Aristotle would just so clearly be on the side of the communitarians in the communitarian versus liberalism debate. And then the other thing that piqued my interest is that, I had read Benjamin Constant's famous essay, and in much of the literature I was reading, there was this sort of distinction between the ancients versus the moderns. And again, in that contrast that was set up, someone like Aristotle was always presented as a paradigm of an ancient thinker who thought of the world, the political world, as a place where people are friends with one another, that they're engaged in close-knit, face-to-face relationships, and that there's this sense of togetherness in an Aristotelian political society that you don't find in the modern world, the world of Hobbes and Machiavelli, where people don't relate to each other in some sort of friendly or close way. And again, so that was this contrast that was constantly sort of talked about. And again, that never struck me as correct, because Aristotle, as I was reading him, was maybe had far more to say that was like what you would find in Hobbes or what you would find in Machiavelli. Not the same, certainly, but it just wasn't that the opposition wasn't so clean cut as so many people presuppose. So that's really what got me interested, is the fights between the communitarians and the liberals on one hand, and then the distinction between the ancients and the moderns on the other. And I just didn't feel that Aristotle in particular was being portrayed correctly in either of those debates. And so that's how I got interested in initially asking questions about how did Aristotle think about conflict. And then there was a book by a guy named Bernard Yack, and who sort of was interested in the same kind of questions. He wrote a book called Problems of the Political Animal. And that book got me interested in what convinced me that there was enough scholarly material and scholarly questions here that I could really make a project into this.
So when we talk about, theorizations of conflict among ancient Greek philosophers, are we predominantly talking about Aristotle, or is there others who have also written about it?
Yeah, the theme of conflict does come up in other philosophers, but what really is interesting to me about Aristotle, and this is the thesis for which I argue in my book, is that he thought that there are profoundly different kinds of conflict. And this is an important idea. Philosophers like Plato and others like him tend to think of conflict as just one kind of thing. It can be big, it can be small, it can be all-encompassing, it can be siloed, but fundamentally conflict is always the same kind of thing and should be conceptualized as one kind of thing. And oftentimes it's conceptualized as war. But as I read Aristotle, it's interesting is he thinks that there isn't one kind of conflict. Political societies can feature competition. Political societies can feature disagreement. Political societies can feature partisan conflict. And then finally, political societies can come apart in actual war. But all four of those are very different kinds of human phenomena, and they each deserve their own independent analysis, and they're all caused by different things. So what's really distinctive about Aristotle, on my reading, is that he's disaggregating these things that other philosophers tend to just lump together as one sort of thing to deal with.
So, I mean, then zeroing in more on Aristotle, particularly, you've written a lot about his theory of partisanship, and the way that people kind of go into ideological camps. Can you just talk a little bit more about how he defines that concept in his work, particularly Politics and Nicomachean Ethics?
Right. So one quick thing is partisanship is the word that I use to try to capture what I think Aristotle is talking about. So there's no Greek word that's the obvious stand-in for partisanship. But here's what you find in Aristotle, and then maybe you can tell me whether you think this sounds like partisanship or not. I think it does. But Aristotle thinks that all political communities show a certain kind of cleavage. All political societies are broken up into different kinds of groups. And the two groups that show up most frequently are, they go by different names, but we'll just call them for the sake of this conversation. There's on the one hand, the rich, who are few in number. And on the other hand, there are the poor, who are many in number. And Aristotle thinks that all political societies tend to feature these two groups. Now, what's particularly interesting is Aristotle thinks that these two groups won't just be distinguished in terms of the social traits they have, namely the amount of wealth they have, or the amount of, I guess I should say, social resources they have, and then just literally how many they are in number. But he thinks that both of those groups tend to adopt a very distinctive kind of psychology. And the psychology he attributes to those two groups is one where they both have a very set theory of conception of justice. They both have different conceptions of what it means to be flourishing as a human being. They both have very different emotions from one another. And they both believe that only people like them have the best view on the way political decision-making should take place. So they really do have their whole psychological approach to politics is profoundly different from one another. And so that's why, I believe that that's why Aristotle consistently describes these two groups as being just like oil and water. They do not mix. They are always suspicious of one another, and they're always on the verge of getting into some kind of brawl or some kind of fight, because their worldviews are very different, and they believe that the other group is completely wrong in their approach. So Aristotle thinks that most political societies will always feature those two groups who are really just sticking up for their part of the society rather than for the whole of society. And psychologically, they're locked into doing so. So that's why I think partisanship is an effective way of describing or summarizing Aristotle's theory.
When you say that it separates into rich and poor and their psychological states are entirely different, that reminds me a lot of Marx. So is this a theory that's similar to Marxist theory, or does Aristotle's vision differentiate itself from Marx in some kind of way?
Yeah, there are similarities. There clearly are some similarities in that Aristotle does believe that if you go into a city and just want to quickly describe, where's the main site of tension in this society, he does think that more often than not, that tension is going to be between the richer folks and the poorer folks. Now, so there is a similarity. And I think, different Marxists have often remarked on this and found a lot of resources in Aristotle. Now, but the difference, however, is that Aristotle never wants to reduce the conflict to partisan conflict to just differences in wealth. And in fact, it's the differences in the psychologies of these two groups that ends up being the very problematic part. Because Aristotle says you can have people who are poor from the poor who end up making a lot of money, but they're still looking out at the world in a way where they're thinking like a poor person. So, maybe even wealth isn't the key metric that's going on. It's rather the psychology of that the people have in terms of their theory of justice, their theory of happiness, and then the different emotions that they have. So, for Aristotle, the poor, and I'm putting those in quotation marks because they might actually have quite a bit of money. For Aristotle, they believe that happiness is being able to do whatever you want. Justice is having everyone end up being the same or given equal amounts of social goods. And finally, Aristotle thinks that they tend to suffer from envy of anyone who raises above the crowd in some way. And vice versa for the rich, the people who have lots of social resources, they tend to suffer from arrogance. They tend to think that happiness is just acquiring lots of money. And they think that the justice demands that the people who are successful in life, in terms of their wealth, are given the most social control as well. So it's a story that resembles Marx maybe in one way, but the psychological picture involves things that go way beyond just wealth. It's really a clash in conceptions of justice, a clash in conceptions of happiness, and a clash in people's emotional repertoire as well.
And are we meant to take these distinctions literally, or is he setting up a theoretical basis for how societies generally organize themselves?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what he's trying to do is he thinks that these are sort of paradigmatic ways of thinking about the main social blocks you'll find in society. Any given society might have people who aren't quite like that cartoonish type. And he himself makes more fine-grained distinctions among those people who are poorer in social resources versus people who are richer in resources. So, for example, among the people who are poorer in social resources, he includes people like successful craftsmen, farmers, people like that, as well as people who barely have enough money just to scrape by day and who are wage laborers. So there's differences among people who are poorer in social resources, even though all of them might be fit under this sort of stereotype that he's trying to theorize. And on the other side, among the rich, he thinks that there can be lots of smaller landowners and people who have estates who are quite a bit different from people of dynastic wealth, who are from these very old established families who have so much wealth that they, aren't even that attached to the city anymore because their wealth expands well beyond the political boundaries of the city. So again, they're within this stereotype of people who are rich in social resources. even there's lots of differences on the ground in any given city. So, I think he takes himself as offering these sort of stereotypes that should offer you a way of starting your analysis when you go into a city. But then he also thinks that you should be ready to notice differences and subtle variations from one place to another.
And so am I correct in saying that he believes that these two groups that are so psychologically divergent, it's possible that they lead toward what he defines as stasis, right? And so could you, before we talk about how that arises, could you just define what we're actually talking about when we say stasis?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually how my book starts out, because I think this is such an important point. So stasis is this word you find Aristotle talking about, and there's this question of how to define it. What does he have in mind with this Greek word? And some people, when they're translating Aristotle and other thinkers, they'll take it as just a very generic word, meaning any kind of conflict. So it could mean everything from a disagreement among neighbors about where a fence should go, all the way to people slitting each other's throats in violent, a coup, a political coup. So one scholar, Moses Finley, said stasis is what he called a portmanteau word. It's a big, broad tent, and lots of different things can go in there. On my way of reading Aristotle, I think he uses stasis in a very specific technical sense, which is, this is civil war. This is when they've drawn their swords, they're ready to engage in violence and fraud or do whatever it takes to fundamentally change the constitution of the city. So stasis is a rare thing, a very a dramatic thing, and it really is different in kind from the typical kinds of political competitions or legal debates that are more typical in society. Those are very different from one another. So on my reading, stasis means civil war, full stop. Now, that said, you can see, if I'm right about the way Aristotle thinks about partisanship, and he's conceptualizing people who are rich and poor in the way on my theory he does, you can see why he thinks that the rich and poor will always be flirting with civil war, because they have radically different theories of what's just. They have radically different theories of what makes a human being worthy of political rule, radically different ways of thinking about happiness. And so these people are constantly going to be very, very, very suspicious of the other side. And so if you want to make your society, for Aristotle, if you want to make civil war more likely, what you should do is make your society so that no one exists except the rich and the poor. It's like creating a tinderbox, and you're making it very likely that some kind of violent conflict is going to resolve. So this is why his big solution for decreasing the chance of civil war in most societies is to try to find ways to promote and increase a strong middle class. That is a group of people who aren't terribly resource rich, but who also aren't resource poor, but who are in the middle and don't suffer from the emotional and psychological prejudices that those other two groups do.
And so does he think that this is metaphysically possible, not metaphysically, but is it possible that to eliminate kind of this conflict in society, or is this inevitably going to happen no matter how strong a middle class you create, no matter which group of people you put together, how virtuous they are? Is there always going to be conflict according to him, or is there some possibility that we can eliminate that from society?
Yeah, the answer is yes or no. The answer is it's not metaphysically impossible to create a society that doesn't have partisan conflict. He imagines what that kind of society would be like at the very end of his work, The Politics. He calls it the city of our prayers. It's the kind of city where everything would need to be going just right. You would have to have people who were psychologically predisposed and educated in just the right way, who are inhabiting just the right kind of land and just the right kind of geography, who were situated vis-a-vis other cities in just the right way. So it's metaphysically, there is a possibility out there for the city of our prayers. But he thinks that is extraordinarily difficult, and you'd have to be very lucky to ever come across a city that's situated in that way. So in most times and in most places, the city of the prayers isn't an option. Rather, what you're going to be doing is dealing with these different blocks, these different social groups who really won't be on the same terms with one another. So you'll be trying to mitigate partisan conflict. And that's the situation you'll be basically stuck with. So it's not metaphysically impossible, but it is practically impossible for nearly all the cases most people will face.
I mean, do you think that's even desirable? A society without conflict? Because it seems like when you have a society with competition and attachment to things, there's naturally going to be conflict that arises, right? If there's a job position that two people want, they're naturally going to compete for that job position, and that's going to create some sort of conflict, however small. So is it even desirable to eliminate that conflict, or do we want a little bit of conflict in society?
Right. Well, just notice, that's a great question. Although notice you slipped into language that sort of made conflict sound like it's one kind of thing. Like, do we want conflict or should we root it out? And I think the precise answer to that is to say, yeah, the best kinds of societies are going to have competitions for honor. The best kind of societies are actually going to do a good job registering the debates and the disagreements that the society needs to happen, given the complexity of the situations and decisions it's facing. And so competition for honor and disagreement, definitely you don't want to root those out, because competing for honor, at least if you're an Aristotelian, is part of leading a flourishing, happy life. And having smart and articulate people articulate disagreements and who are registering different kinds of evidence, you want them entering the arena of debate so that all these different points of view are on the table and open for discussion and analysis. But by contrast, just because you are open to debate and competition, that doesn't mean then you shouldn't worry about partisanship. And in fact, you should be taking steps in your society, just I think like Aristotle recommends, to try and decrease the virulence of that partisan conflict between those two sort of camps who have the radically different psychological profiles. And I think Aristotle's right that probably the best way of doing that is by trying to adopt policies in your society that will lead to a large middle class. I think Aristotle's on to something with that. And now, look, that's not going to erase partisanship, but you can definitely sort of stamp it down and keep it at bay, so that your society can spend more time with productive disagreement and productive competition.
So coming back to the point about the rich and the poor, and the rich valuing wealth and material things for their happiness, and the poor valuing freedom and the capacity to be equal. I'm just wondering, number one, if you think there's any modern day applicability to those distinctions, but also if you could, before that, explain, because it makes sense to me how the rich, if they want to accumulate if their happiness is dependent on accumulation of wealth, that they're never going to be satisfied or happy, and there's always going to be some sort of conflict brewing in their minds. But to talk about the poor and the valuing freedom, I think that's a confusing thing to a lot of people. Well, the question might arise, well, why wouldn't you want the most freedom possible? Why isn't that a desirable thing? Why shouldn't people be able to have the most freedom they want? And why is that something that would potentially be in conflict with others?
Yeah, well, let me say a few. There's a lot there. So follow up on the question. If I start going off here on a tangent, just one quick thing I want to begin by saying is, Aristotle's analysis of the rich is another kind of reason that the Marxist analysis doesn't quite work with Aristotle, which is he actually thinks that rich people not only will they have partisan conflict with the poor, but he also thinks that the rich are going to be so devoted to wealth acquisition that they'll be fighting with one another all the time as well. He doesn't think that in general these rich oligarchs, as he calls them, are able to work well with one another very well. And so they often cause all sorts of problems in their society because they're trying to knife each other in the back to try to make that much more wealth. But I guess the thing that is confusing, let me say that it is easy to appreciate then how the idea that someone who just wants more and more and more wealth, I think we can all sort of readily appreciate how that would just be problematic to society. Because if someone is just fixated on wealth, they're not really stepping back and thinking about how their own life will play a part in making the common good flourish, right? Arriving at some sort of policy that doesn't just help them or just help the rich, but also helps the poor, and that can help kind of everyone win. And I think you're right that it is a little harder to understand why Aristotle would be equally as critical of the people he thinks are poorer in social resources, where they think that being happy just means to be able to do whatever you want, and that you're as good as anyone else. We're all of equal value. And so it's a little hard to appreciate why that would be so problematic. And I think, Aristotle's way of thinking about that is that someone who thinks that anything they desire should be satisfied, and that whatever desire they have is as good as any other desire they have, is someone who fundamentally doesn't understand that some goods are better than other goods. Some things in life really are more valuable than other things, just objectively. And someone who doesn't have a sense of which things are more important and less important, the thing that's problematic about that, I guess there's two things, is first of all, that person is fundamentally directionless. And they won't have a very good sense of which way society should go, or what society should be trying to organize as its resources in pursuit of. So they certainly won't find anything like Aristotelian happiness if they think that every desire is as good as any other desire. But I think Aristotle's other criticism of this idea is just, human beings have so many desires that's an endless quest. If you really are just trying to satisfy every desire in your soul, every desire you might have, that'll be something that you'll be searching after your entire life, and you'll never get there. Our desires just are infinitely needy. And so that's the way in which the Aristotle's poor ends up resembling Aristotle's rich, is that there's this way in which there's this endless pursuit that really never can be satisfied. And if that's the thing you're seeking, is you never will have time and energy to step back and look at the common good and try to appreciate the way in which your own life is just a part of a group of people, some of whom are different than you, and where you need to be favoring policies where not everyone is getting everything they want, but we're all looking to play our roles so that the whole thing can work together for the sake of a common good, rather than just the good of one particular part. So that's the way in which Aristotle problematizes the poor. Now, like we said earlier, there is something kind of cartoonish about that. He clearly is sort of engaging in a stereotype there. But I think he's just doing that for the sake of these, painting this broad picture so that you can appreciate where the partisan conflict in society is most likely to arise.
So I actually want to save the part about if you think that this distinction is attributable to kind of modern day phenomenon and modern day people to later. But I do want to ask. So I think you've set the stage of the wants and desires of and the psychological condition of both the poor and the rich. So we're starting out with this initial what you call partisan conflict. So then the question is, how does this conflict escalate? How do the temperature rise into something like civil war, like Stasis? How do we get there? Because we're starting with partisan conflict, but then the main thing is we want to prevent escalation.
Yeah, that's great. So in Book 5 of Aristotle's Politics, as I read it, he gives this very interesting theory of why civil war happens. And he lays out sort of a very elaborate diagnostic, let's call it, for the origins of civil war. And so here's the profile. Again, this is all on my reading, but as I understand it, here's how he gives this kind of universal profile of the person who's going to start a civil war. And so there's sort of three parts to this. So first of all, he thinks that the person who raises the sword and is ready to go to war, to engage in civil war, is someone who fundamentally is motivated by the idea that the current order is unfair. It's unjust. There's something, the person's sense of equality has been violated, right? And there'll be different versions of that. Some people their version will be, I'm as good as anyone else, and the current regime is saying some people are better. That's not fair, and I'm going to end that. On the other hand, you might have people who say, look, I'm clearly better than other people. I'm not being treated fairly because I'm just being treated like any garden variety, like anyone else. But in both cases, the person is going to have this feeling of they haven't been treated fairly by the regime, right? So that's the kind of first part. Is the person's drawing the sword, and that's going to be the thing they're thinking about. Now, Aristotle thinks that the immediate reason they will have drawn their sword, this is what I call the trigger for civil war, will be that they will have witnessed some kind of honor or dishonor or some kind of penalty or reward being given to someone that where they see it happen and they think, you know what, this is the last straw. I just can't handle this anymore. If that person over there is getting that monetary reward, well, that's it. I've had it. I'm now going to, that's my tripwire. I'm now going to draw my sword and start fighting. So the triggers, Aristotle thinks, always come in the form of money or honor, involving you or your friends in one way or the other. But then maybe the third part of his analysis, and this is really where your question comes, is Aristotle thinks that it takes a lot to get a human being to the point where they're just a trigger event away from drawing their sword and being motivated by the sense of fairness. It takes a lot to get a person to that state. And so he outlines a number of things that I call spectacles. That is, things you see over time that slowly lead you to the conclusion that the constitutional order in which you're living is fundamentally erroneous and fundamentally unjust. And what I love about Aristotle is there's no silver bullet here. There's no one causal factor that does this. Aristotle just identifies a whole bunch of different kinds of things that over time can add up to making you think that this place needs to be burned down. And so there's 7 of them. And here it is real quickly. It's that you see spectacles where people are making profit. They're getting money in some way. You see another spectacle is you see certain people winning awards or honors that strikes you as unjust. Another spectacle is that you see people in ruling positions that make you afraid, that make you fearful. Another is that you see people in ruling positions that you think that you're superior to. Another spectacle is you see people in ruling positions that you think are ludicrous and you have contempt for them. And then finally, Aristotle thinks is that you look out at your society and you see that the other side is growing too quickly, right? And so this is especially true, Aristotle thinks, when rich people, the oligarchs, look out and they see huge numbers of poor people increasing. So they feel like as a proportion of society, they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and the number of poor is getting larger and larger and larger. And so that their sense of their relative size, it's one of those spectacles they see that will start to put them on edge. So anyway, there's never for Aristotle one root cause of civil war or stasis. Just the history of any given city might be a little different than the history of other cities. But in general, what you have is human beings who see these spectacles, and they just over time add up until the person is more and more agitated that the regime they're living in is basically unfair. And then some triggering event happens that finally makes them decide to initiate civil war. So anyway, I'm sorry that answer went on for so long. But as I understand it, he really does try to lay out kind of a global theory of the factionalizer, the person who engages in civil war. And he designs that theory in a way where that theory will accommodate a virtuous person who goes to civil war against a vicious regime. But this theory also will accommodate civil wars where there's no virtuous people involved, where it'll be different kinds of partisans warring on each other. But his theory will explain both those kind of situations.
I mean, when you were laying out the reasons and the things, so many just light bulbs went off in my head about modern day phenomenon and things that really trigger people. I'm thinking about the U.S. That trigger people in the U.S. today with people getting things that they feel like don't deserve them, or them leaping ahead, or people feeling like the people in power are not very smart or not very intelligent. There's so many things that I feel like could be applicable to our modern time. So just wanted to say that.
Yep.
I had a question.
Can I ask? Just let me add one quick thing here. and maybe this is where we're going, but just notice how, if Aristotle's right that rich people tend to become partisan in the way he imagines, and poor people who are resource poor tend to become partisan the way Aristotle thinks. You can see, given that list of 7 things I just named, I mean, you can see how people like those 2 categories are going to see these triggering spectacles all over the place. A partisan is someone who's seeing examples after example after example in their mind of all of these things taking place. And so it just makes sense that Aristotle's partisans are also the most likely to go to civil war. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. Go ahead.
No. The question that I had was because we were talking about, just forms of conflict that relate to, job positions or, maybe school choice or something like that. But it occurred to me that also, even if those things aren't strictly partisan conflict, that the fact that those things, that people see those things as meritable or being honorable, and those positions, those schools, even sports, perhaps, that could actually play a role in triggering this kind of a thing. Because if you view, let's say, I'll just take sports for an example. If you view being on, this sports team or getting a scholarship to play sports at this university as being the most honorable thing or the most important thing, and you see somebody who you feel like doesn't deserve it as much as you get that's going to trigger that same sort of psychological reaction that would impel somebody to draw a sword, let's say. Is that correct?
It could. I mean, I think, one of the interesting things about competition that maybe we don't think about is competition actually presupposes an enormous amount of agreement. Think about, even in sports, think about how when 2 teams, or in boxing or something, when 2 people go into a ring with one another, I mean, even though the conflict between them gets all the attention, think about how basically they have to agree on 99% of all of the things that make that event possible. And it's only if they agree on those 99% of things that both sides, both the winner and the loser, will step away after the event and say, okay, you know what? The winner really does deserve honor because of that. Because we had all this background agreement that makes it possible, even if I'm on the losing side. I can see how that person won the fight, and they deserve the honor that comes with it. Good on them. I wish I would have won, but they deserve to win. They were the better competitor today. And so that kind of attitude is only possible with lots of background agreement. Now, the kind of situation you're talking about is where people have a competition, right? But there's not a lot of background agreement, right, on what the rules are, on who should deserve to win, right? And in that case, what you have really isn't competition anymore. There, you've now, this is just a site of more partisan unfairness. This is more an example where you're like, oh, here we go again. Those people are winning, and we all know why. It's because the system is crooked and broken. And so there, you don't even think honor was at stake. You think that this is just fundamentally another example, another spectacle of injustice. And so in that way, your example wouldn't work, because if the reaction is the one you're talking about, then really there wasn't a competition to begin with. There wasn't enough agreement to really have a legitimate competition right out of the gate.
Well, so then let's amend this example, because when you were saying that, it occurred to me, okay, well, let's say there's a boxing match or a sports competition, and they agree to the rules beforehand. They agree on the terms. It's set up. It's a fair competition, and you have one boxing fight or whatever, and one person wins. Great. And then maybe they meet again and the same person wins. And then they maybe meet again, the same person wins. And it occurred to me that if that happened maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 times, then the person who lost would start to say, well, hang on a minute. Maybe I don't agree to the rules anymore. Maybe we need to change them because they're unfair. And that could potentially happen in a society where people feel like their opportunity for to have government positions, to have high quality jobs, they initially agreed to the terms and felt like, okay, this is fair, I agree to this. But then after having continually lost or not gotten those positions, then even though maybe the conditions or the terms they agreed upon initially haven't changed that much, they could still feel like, well, I don't agree to these terms anymore because I'm not winning. I'm not obtaining those things that I previously thought was honorable, or in these competitions that I thought were fair and I agreed to.
Right, and that is one possibility that a given person might end up starting to rethink the rules and think exactly the pattern you're talking about. There's another possibility, though, as well that we should entertain, which is after losing that fifth or sixth fight, the person says, you know what? I think that other person is just a better fighter than I am. That other person is a better boxer. And so the takeaway I should have from this is I'll look for some role to play in this world. That role isn't, though, going to be the winner of the best boxer. I'll look for another role. Maybe I can be a referee in future fights, or maybe I can become a trainer for future boxers, or maybe I'll spend my life on the amateur or minor league circuit or whatever. But so you're right. One takeaway might be, hey, wait a second, the whole system needs to be rethought. Another takeaway, though, might just be, societies do have people at the top and people who are not at the top. And that's just the way societies work. And I think, maybe this is kind of hard to hear, or maybe it's unusual to hear people say this, but I think the Aristotelian approach is to say, all societies are going to feature these groups of the few more elite people, and then the far larger number of non-elite people, the people who are poorer in social resources versus the people who are richer in social resources. And the Aristotelian is that's always going to be the case. The difference between societies isn't whether you find those two groups. The difference is whether there are mechanisms to ensure that everyone is treated well in that system, and that the policies and decisions that are made are in the common interest of everyone, and not just either of those two groups or some other partisan group. But the goal for an Aristotelian is never, or an Aristotle's approach isn't, hey, let's just get rid of all of the hierarchy. Let's get rid of all the winners and the losers and make everyone equal. For Aristotle, that there is no social world that's like that. That's just an impossibility. So it's not one you really should try to bring about. At the end of the day, no one would become a boxer. no one would join a sports team if you are really good for 5 years, then the whole ring gets taken apart.
Right. That makes sense. And perhaps sports is not the greatest example because people don't view that as life and death kind of, or they're dependent on their own happiness the same way that you describe these partisans, these rich and the poor depend on the, money and freedom. Like that is what determines how happy they are and how meritable their life is. and so it is like life and death to them. So perhaps
That's
sports isn't the best example, but that also led me to ask about an earlier point you made, because you mentioned briefly about how to uh, not resolve this conflict, but de-escalate, and that's kind of where I want to turn now. When you said that for him, it's about having a strong middle class, developing a
right.
strong middle class, and
In most places, yeah.
and that not only struck me as interesting because of his theory of the mean, and with virtue ethics being, between two levels of um, different traits, and that's where virtue lies. But it also struck me as interesting because it occurred to me that the middle people in the middle class, they're comfortable where they are, and so they're not as susceptible to like these kind of indifferences in power and these imbalances or balances between those who have honor and those who don't have honor. But I'd like to hear from you about why he thinks that having a strong middle class is a way to reduce these tensions.
Right. Well, he thinks that. Well, first of all, he's actually somewhat pessimistic. He thinks it's very hard to create a society with a large middle class. First of all, he thinks that it's an incredible political achievement to have a city with a large middle class. But here's just like he paints a psychological profile of the typical rich and resources and the typical stereotype of the people who are poor. He also has this kind of stereotype that he paints of a middle group, middlings. First of all, the thing that's noticeable about them is they don't suffer from the same emotional defects that the rich and poor do. So remember, the rich for him are people who tend to be arrogant, and the poor tend to be envious. Well, Aristotle thinks that the middlings, they're not particularly arrogant. They don't have a lot of hubris. And on the other hand, they're not particularly envious either. So they don't have these obvious emotional defects. Moreover, for them, even though they're not perfectly virtuous, they're not like a full-blown, flourishing, happy person in the Aristotelian sense. Nonetheless, they're passively virtuous for Aristotle. And so they do believe, they do think that there's more to life than making money. They don't think money is the be-all and end-all. And on the other hand, they also think that some things really are better than others. So they don't have that kind of happiness is just doing whatever you feel like. They have a sense of honor. They have a sense of a hierarchy of values. They do think that the civic good is more important than individual goods. And they're able to assess they have a basic sense of decency, a basic sense of fair play. In general, they're not looking just to get on a treadmill of getting more and more and more wealth or more and more desire satisfaction. They have a sort of sense that they're part of a community and the communal good is important for them. So they're happy to be in situations where there's rotational rule, where some people rule for some time, then they'll step down and let other people rule. They're fine with that. So he has this interesting and rich psychological portrait of the middle class, just like he does the rich and the poor. And again, that's maybe a stereotype, but he thinks that that's kind of at least a good starting point for theorizing what this group of people might be like that would be so helpful.
I mean, in many people's theories of revolutions and such, they talk about how the middle class is much less likely to participate in the revolution because they're not willing to risk what they have. They're comfortable.
Yeah.
Maybe they're a little bit concerned about their freedoms being taken away or not making a ton of money, but they have enough money to sustain themselves. And so this idea of drawing the sword and giving up everything to overthrow the system is just not that desirable to them because they are comfortable within the system.
Right. And notice just, well, again, first of all, it's not just money. That's why I keep saying rich in social wealth or social capital. Like, it's middle class people, first of all, and the people at the top. Part of what they have that's great is wealth, but they also have just opportunities to do more in life. They get to experience more kind of dramatic festivals, and they get to participate in politics more than other people, and they get to do the kinds of activities that give life meaning. So it's not just a wealth thing. So that's partly why, middle class people in general are going to be. It's difficult to get them to become revolutionaries because they really are enjoying some of the things that makes life, worth living. Like in an Aristotelian sense, not just a desire satisfaction sense. They're partaking of some higher things.
So to kind of turn to more how this applies to current society and our modern country way of life, etc. I want to ask you just if you think that Aristotle's idea, not just of poor and rich in the literal sense, because obviously there's a poor class and there's a rich class, but if this idea of the psychological difference in their mental states and the way that they value happiness and merit, do you see that existing in our current society and in the U.S. today?
I see it in nearly all points of history that I've read about, let alone in the contemporary world. I think, the nice thing about Aristotle's analysis is that in some helpful ways, it's open-ended. In a lot of fruitful ways, he's laying out these sort of general themes that I think can be readily accommodated to different historical times and periods. Now, there's always this danger of just, if a hammer is your only tool, everything looks like a nail. You've heard that idea. And I'm always leery of, yes, I've spent a lot of my life studying Aristotle, and now, no surprise, I look out in the world and every political phenomenon I see is going to be, readily conceptualized in Aristotelian terms. But that said, I do think that a lot of the things he's pointing out do find resonance in our political situation today. There are differences. The way power works now is different. The scope of political communities is very different. The sheer number of human beings involved is very different. And that makes the kinds of dynamics involved, I think, somewhat different. But I think there are still a lot of similarities that make Aristotle relevant, even if you can't just take Aristotle and just have him explain everything. I don't think that's the case, but he definitely is a great starting point for analysis.
I mean, it seems clear to me, and I think most people would not disagree with this, that people in today's society who are fundamentally concerned with wealth as the most important thing, certainly that exists at least to an extent in our modern world, and I think that's going to be the case for eternity. But the point about people, do you think that people are also, or some people are too concerned about individual freedoms and establishing equality for all, not in the sense of people have less rights than other people, but in the sense of honor and awards and prestige, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, I do think people can be very myopic. I do think people can have kind of bad theories of happiness. And I do think that when you have a bad theory of happiness and what makes a life flourishing, I do think there are consequences for that. And in the modern world, in the contemporary world, I do think there are people who think that just having more and more money is a sufficient condition for happiness. And I do think they will lead problematic lives that will also be problematic for those around them. On the other hand, I think a theory of happiness that just says it's whatever satisfies your desires, I think that is also something that you hear people embrace. And again, and I think that is deeply problematic, both for the person, for themselves, and for those they're surrounded by. So, I do think that believing that happiness is something that can be identified in an objective way, maybe not as exactly as Aristotle laid it out in the Nicomacheans and Eudemian Ethics, but in something like what he was doing, I think is still a helpful and productive thing. And I think when push comes to shove, I think most people do intuitively believe that some ways of being happy are sort of counterfeit and don't really make a person happy, and other ways of being happy are more sustainable, more deeply enjoyable, and that just make for a truly flourishing life. I think even if people haven't thought about it, I think most people have an intuition that there's something to that. And I think, I'm not saying anything novel in this, but I think this happens especially when people become parents of children and they're having to make these decisions about what will make their child happy. I think there you see that they put their cards on the table that, some ways of living a life will lead to more happiness than others. And they don't just let their kids do whatever their kids want. They really do think that their kids could spend their lives in better or worse ways. So anyway, that's a long way of answering your question, which is say, I think there's something still to this idea that poor theories of happiness are seen today, and some of those bad theories do resemble the ones Aristotle was criticizing so long.
Well, we've talked a lot about bad theories of happiness. It's kind of a loaded question, but do you think there is a theory of happiness that is preferable to others? Does Aristotle's own theory of happiness hold a lot of weight, do you think?
Yeah, I do. I mean, some of the world we live in is importantly different in some ways because of, I guess, it's the size of political communities and the technology available and the ways in which we're able to spend our time, I think, are different. But fundamentally, Aristotle's his proposal, his idea for what makes for a happy life, a flourishing life, is that you're exercising your rational capacities in an excellent way, not just in an average or poor way, but you're exercising your rational capacities in an excellent way over a long period of your life. And I really think that there's something to that. And I know my own experience is kind of in my own life and in the lives of those I've seen around me. I think that is fundamentally correct. that people who are the most flourishing are leading rational lives where they're using their rational mind to deeply explore and understand the world around them and to interact in that world in a sustainable and enjoyable way.
Is there anything about our kind of current time, whether it be the advent of social media and kind of short clickbait, 30-second clips that capture people's attentions and get them addicted, whether it be the 24-hour news cycle, whether it be just kind of being bombarded with information and notifications on phones, that you think makes that, meaning Aristotle's theory of happiness, more difficult to obtain in our modern society?
Yeah, I think that's true. I do think that's true. I think there are more ways to divert your time and energy that there have been before. I mean, I just imagine what it was like to live in a rural Greek community in the ancient world, where just there wouldn't be a lot of change maybe from day to day. And just think how different it is now that you can sit, in a chair and play a game for 5 minutes, then watch news clips, then go to a TikTok feed, then check up on your friends on social media, just in time to get another news flash, just in time to check the weather because your phone now is warning you there's a tornado. Like, it's just, there is a lot of opportunity for a kind of constant diversion. I think that is true. Now, on the other hand, though, I am somewhat optimistic about this. I think we're living in a time where these technologies are being created for really the first time. And there's kind of a wild west of social media and all these different technological opportunities. But notice that at the very same time that the number of diversions has popped up, we're also creating more and more opportunities for deep engagement. Like take this podcast series that you've set up, right? And that other people have set up. I think a lot of people enjoy a long form discussion. They don't want just a sound bite. They don't want to just watch something, a news clip that lasts for 3 minutes. They want to hear people talk to one another and explore ideas together. And so, I mean, yes, it's true. We have all these abilities to distract ourselves, but we're also increasing the different ways in which we can really be happy in an Aristotelian sense. And I am optimistic that at the end of the day, we are still rational animals, and that there is something that human beings will seek and develop over time. So it's just one more thing for us to navigate as a species. I don't think it's the end of us or anything like that, or the end of our happiness.
Well, I'm currently in journalism school, and so one of the things that keeps on coming up is kind of the rise and the advent of social media journalism and independent journalism and all these things. And a big discussion people are having is whether or not it needs to be regulated and monitored to prevent, misinformation, as they say, from spreading. And I read in an interview with Zan Bog entitled "Navigating Rough Seas" that you said that it's equally important to do that for "quote unquote" elite media or mainstream media if we want to prevent more partisan political violence. I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on that point a bit, because I found it very interesting.
Yeah, well, if Aristotle's correct, and all societies do feature sort of an elite group of those who are resource rich on the one hand, and then people who are resource poorer at the bottom. If that's just the setup you're going to be dealing with in society, and then maybe a middle class kind of navigating between the two. If you're going to have tools where one group is able to control the mistakes of the other group, right? You've got to make sure that other group has tools at its disposal to take care of the mistakes of the first group. You can't set up a situation where people who are in elite positions get to catch all the mistakes of everyone else, but they themselves are never held accountable for their own mistakes. Everyone in society, all the different groups, both the elite and the poorer, have to be held accountable. And some of the proposals I've heard for, controlling misinformation or disinformation or malinformation or whatever formulation you want, it just presupposes that, well, of course, the people in the elite class will be the ones policing this and deciding what is disinformation or not, or malinformation or not. And I'm okay with people in elite positions doing that in some way, but I'm not comfortable with that unless we also give tools to the vast majority of people who aren't as rich in social capital, whereby they can control the misinformation, malinformation, and disinformation coming from the elite classes too. So it has to be a two-way street. And I think any attempt to just make it a one-way street is just a huge problem. And I think it would feed into those spectacles that I was talking about earlier of contempt, superiority, and fear that are long-term kind of causes of making people feel that the regime they're living under is fundamentally unjust. And so anyway, that was what I was trying to get at in that interview. It's not that I think that all information is equally good and that there should be no policing of any information. I'm not sure that makes sense. But I just picking one elite group out as the single group that gets to control that to me is a recipe for disaster.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and I think a lot of people are gonna find be very sympathetic to that point. You also said that you think we need stricter libel laws in the U.S. I know the U.S. has some of the most lax libel laws in the world, and you said because to make it easier to hold someone accountable who publicly smears you. Again, could you just elaborate on why you think that's the case? And are you at all worried that such a policy would lead to, stricter free speech laws? And if so, is that even a bad thing?
Look, I believe deeply in freedom of speech. I'm a strong believer in the First Amendment. Now, and so yes, I am worried by my own proposal. I think there are dangers, but I also believe that those are dangers that can be navigated and dealt with, because I think it's just as dangerous to let human beings who are supposed to be living together in a political community to defame one another, to try to dishonor one another, and to try to deliberately make each other's lives miserable on the basis of lies. That kind of thing tears us apart, and I think it makes it impossible to have legitimate competitions for political power, for good jobs. Like, you want competition, but if people are able to libel one another, it makes that kind of competition less likely. Also, you need a society in which people can have good faith disagreements and debates. But when you're able to defame other people, again, that's a recipe for making sure that you're not going to end up having good and healthy and productive debates. So I am worried that libel laws could be used in a way that would impinge on our free speech rights. I'm not naive about that. And that is something I would worry about and that we would need to be vigilant about. But on the other hand, I just think we've now almost normalized just brutally anti-social behavior that just transforms people into partisans and makes people think of themselves as enemies of one another in a way that just makes any kind of social cohesion impossible. And I think that's a mistake. I don't think that people can feel like they're living productive, healthy, flourishing lives in an environment where someone can just come along and defame you without any consequences.
So you mentioned that you very much believe in the First Amendment and freedom of speech. When I told some of my fellow philosophy students and friends that I was going to be speaking to you, they were incredibly interested in the Dissident Philosophers project. and I know that you part of that. You wrote an essay for the project or the book, and so I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit about why you got involved with that project and what the overall purpose of it is. As I'm sure many of people watching, friends that I know, and just me personally, am incredibly interested to hear about it.
Yeah, well, the idea of that anthology was that there are a number of us across the country, philosophers across the country, who think of ourselves as conservative in one way or another, or who just don't see ourselves as agreeing with sort of the multicultural, cosmopolitan, progressive themes that are often embraced by most of our colleagues in higher education. And so the original idea of that anthology, it was this, is that each of us was tasked with just kind of giving an autobiography of, how did you end up thinking this way, where you're thinking things that are kind of at odds with so many of your other colleagues. And so, each of us kind of had our own idiosyncratic paths that we took to believing what we do. And I think, therefore, all of us in that anthology ended up having very kind of different projects. It wasn't like there was one goal. I think more the idea was just each of the people who contributed in that anthology were trying to sort of explain where they're coming from, or how they ended up thinking what they believe in a way that's at odds with a number of kind of the more progressive or left-leaning points of view. So there's not a single theme, I think, that ties all of those essays together. It was just an opportunity for all of us to explore our own unique paths to kind of our different versions of conservatism.
I mean, one of the things that I've noticed in recent years, or maybe this has been a trend for a while, but kind of people with dissident voices, let's say, or views that diverge from kind of the mainstream academia, particularly on the political spectrum, feel distraught with higher education and academia. And I'm wondering if you think that is because, well, I guess, what is your diagnosis of that cause? And do you think it has something to do with the fact that there is such an imbalance ideologically between like the way that professors think across the United States and in the world, and the professors view what they think is important, what they merit, what they view as politically important, versus other people?
Yeah, I want to stress, I don't think there's one answer to that question. I think different dissident philosophers are going to have different ways of handling that kind of question. I think for me, I think there were two kind of big things that made me feel less and less sort of happy, or more, your language, as you said, more distraught, I think. And that's first of all, what I noticed happening in my classrooms is that I found it harder and harder and harder to just get my students to debate one another, just to get them to entertain, just for the sake of argument. Like, hey, take a position that I know you don't agree with, but just take that position and let's just have fun having a disagreement about it and just see where our debate goes. And what I noticed is that students got less and less comfortable with having debates and disagreements with one another in the classroom setting where their peers could see them that way. And so, and that sort of distresses me. and makes me distraught, because I think part of the wonderful thing about philosophy is, you have a chance to engage in all of these incredibly interesting disagreements and famous debates about all these different issues. And so that's maybe the first let me put it this way, the repertoire of our students. It seemed like they hadn't been flexing their disagreement muscles at all. And so that disagreeing with other people was this new experience that they had never had. And, so that's sort of the first thing that made me feel sort of less and less satisfied with what's going on in higher education, is just it seemed to be less a place where disagreement was happening. But then I think the second thing, and this is related to it, is that, in our country, we've for a long time been having incredibly interesting and profound debates about very deep and important things. Like, what is a country? Like, just to pick one out, what does it mean to be a citizen of America? Let alone questions about, you pick it. When does human life begin in the abortion debate? Or should we pick whatever great and important debates you want, where there are, on both sides of those debates, there are incredibly intelligent, well-meaning people, who want to be part of the debate. And I think it's pretty clear that we as a country have these huge, big debates. And so the thing that was making me distraught is it seemed like higher education was less, it was rarely the case that those debates were taking place on college campuses and on university campuses. And instead, what was happening is higher education is just grooming people to be on one side of those debates. And I think in the long term, that's a dangerous thing for higher education to do, because it ends up making it look like higher education is partisan. And it's a recipe for people coming along and saying, you know what's the point of higher education if the big debates we're having as a country, and maybe even as a civilization, aren't being registered there in any deep and important way? So, I think that's the thing that made me feel more distraught, is that the big important debates that we're having as a country aren't showing up here on college campuses. They're taking place outside of higher education. And now, like, on Substack, like on podcasts, in independent media, like that's where all the intellectual fervor and big debates are being taken out. And so I think for me personally, those were the two big things. There's the more typical things about cancel culture and wokeness and all of that, but that really, to me, isn't the main thing going on. To me, the idea is that disagreement muscles aren't being flexed, and ultimately we weren't. University and colleges, campuses aren't places where you're hearing the best and deepest versions of the big debates that we're having as a country.
Last question. What is your diagnosis for the reason that these debates and disagreements, and people are afraid to disagree with each other in the classroom? What's your diagnosis for the reason that's happening?
I think there are lots of different reasons. I'm going to sound sophomoric, I think, if I just pick one and try to reduce it to some simple explanation. But I can tell you what my worry is.
Okay.
And that is that our society has become more oligarchic. Our society has become one in which to use the Aristotelian language, the elite few who are resource rich are now controlling decision making for all of society in a way that they hadn't before. And I do think, and let's just entertain that thought for a minute. I could be wrong, of course, but if that is the case, I think a lot of students feel that their only shot of being successful is to make it into that upper class, is to make it into that elite group. And because they think that the stakes are so high to get into that group that controls so much, is that they're more and more hesitant to take risks that would put them at odds with their teachers, their peers, or in any way rock the boat, and that would jeopardize their shot into getting into those decision-making centers. Now, I don't want to. I don't want to sound too pessimistic there, and because part of this could just be our perception about the way things work, and it may not be the case that our country actually is working that way. But nonetheless, I do think there's something to that. I do think that elite decision making now is filtering down and is being pushed down in a way that is somewhat new. And I think that a lot of the student behavior is a response to that. So anyway, that's my kind of off the cuff quick answer to you. I don't know how satisfying that is, but I also want to stress I'm not 100% sure in that answer myself. I'm just entertaining that.
Understood. Well, I think that's a great place to close. Thank you so much, Professor Skultety. Just want to ask, if you want to share what future books, articles, research projects that you're working on ahead to share with whoever's listening, if they're interested, as I'm sure they are, to check out and stay tuned. So if you have any interesting projects coming up.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I'm working on a paper about Plato's Republic right now that I'm actually really excited about, because the idea for this paper came about when I was an undergraduate philosophy major. And it's one of those questions I've walked around with for years and years and years and years, and I've just never given myself a chance to try and figure out what my answer was until now. And so here's the question I'm asking is, famously in Plato's Republic, he makes this very controversial claim that cities won't be well off until philosophers are the ones who rule, right? So this famously leads to people talking about the philosopher kings in Plato's Republic. And of course, that's very controversial. That gets lots of discussion. Who are the philosophers? Why would they be better as rulers than anyone else? And that gets a lot of discussion. However, there's another thing that goes on in Plato's Republic that is equally surprising, but that doesn't get discussed, which is that Plato's philosophers are all people who are professional military fighters. These are people who had to become, elite warriors. So Plato's philosophers in the Republic, they're like SEAL Team 6 people. They're like special forces people who just go on to get extra philosophical training after decades and decades and decades of military training. And so, really, rather than calling them philosopher kings, we should call them the philosopher warrior kings. And so my question has always been, why did Plato require his philosopher rulers to first become military people? I mean, why not just when people are young, they're divided into different groups. Some go on to become philosopher rulers. Some become military fighters. Others become... Why insist that the philosopher rulers have to emerge from the military class? And as I've tried to come up with answers to that question, it's actually hard to come up with a good answer. And so in my current project, I go through and I'm entertaining lots of different answers and showing you why I'm not satisfied with any of them. But the answer that I'm going to try to defend in this paper is that Plato thinks that there's something deeply philosophical about the nature of war itself, and that's why philosophers have to emerge from the warrior class. war isn't some kind of strange ordeal that has nothing to do with philosophy. On the contrary, there's something about going into war that makes one philosophical. And that's going to be my answer. I'm still trying to figure out my argument for that answer, but that's where I'm at right now.
That's incredibly fascinating. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Plato was a wrestler. Is that correct?
Yeah, he had military experience himself, as did his great and famous mentor Socrates. So and one that is one answer I entertain in this paper is maybe this is just a reflection of his own autobiography. He was someone who did some fighting, who then was a philosopher, and so when he's imagining the best city, it's one in which people start out by fighting and then becoming philosophers. But I myself am not satisfied with that, because I think Plato was so self-critical in so many ways that just because his own life had played out that way, I don't think he was just then generalizing from his own example. I think he was trying to adopt political arrangements for principled and philosophical reasons. So I don't think this is just a reflection of his own autobiography. I think there's more to it than that.
Well, that sounds incredibly fascinating. Do you have a title yet, or are you still?
The working title is Philosophy Warrior King in Plato's Republic.
Philosophy Warrior King. Okay, everybody, go get ready for when it's out.
That's right. Well, thank you. I love that. I appreciate you giving me some hype there.
Yeah, I will definitely be reading it.
Great.
Yeah, thankfully my old university email from last year still gives me access to journals and various academic papers and stuff. So I'm still trying to capitalize and read as much as I can before that eventually goes away, if ever. So
I understand.
Yeah. But anyway, thank you so much for doing this. I had a blast. And yeah, just a huge amount of gratitude once again.
Well, it was a pleasure to be here, and congratulations on asking such great and interesting questions. I really
appreciate that. And I should say, my grandmother, she's from Jackson, Mississippi. And
okay.
Yeah, so I'm sure she's going to be watching this, and she goes to the Egg Bowl every year. And
fantastic.
Yeah, so
you're telling me that she loves a good competition, is what you're telling me.
She definitely loves a good competition. But yeah, anyway, what you're in Mississippi, so it's an hour or 2 hours ahead of Eastern time.
Right, we're in Central Time.
Central Time.
So we're one hour back from Eastern Time.
Okay, so it's 4:30 for you. Well, anyway, thank you so much again for doing this. I will hit the stop record button, but guys, remember to subscribe, like this video, and also check out Stephen Skultety's work. It is very, very fascinating. All right.
Thank you.